Of all the glittering doomed Romanovs, her story is perhaps the most human. She wasn't the last czar or the mystical Tsarina or the tragic, beautiful daughters whose names are whispered like a sad fairy tale. She was the one who got away, the one who survived the shipwreck of an empire and lived long enough to tell the tale. She was born in a palace that rivaled Versailles, with 1,000 rooms at her command. She died 78 years later in a cramped apartment above a hair salon in Toronto. Her name was Olga Alexandrovna, the last Grand Duchess of Imperial Russia, and her journey from unimaginable privilege to profound obscurity is one of the most staggering, heartbreaking, and ultimately resilient stories of the 20th century. This isn't just a story about the fall of a dynasty. It's the story of a woman who lost everything, her family, her country, her fortune, and was forced to build a new life from the ashes of the old. It's a story of a fairy tale princess who had to learn to survive in the real world, a world that had violently destroyed hers. The Gilded Cage. To understand Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna of Russia, one must delve deeply into the world she was born into. The late 19th century Imperial Russia, a vast empire spanning continents and cultures, yet riddled with profound contradictions that would shape her life and character. On one hand, it was an era of staggering opulence for the aristocracy, particularly the Romanov dynasty, who ruled as absolute monarchs with divine right. Palaces like the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, gleamed with gold leaf crystal chandeliers and marble halls, where Fabergé eggs, exquisite jeweled masterpieces, were exchanged as casual Easter gifts among family members. Grand balls at the Anichkov Palace or Peterhof lasted until dawn, with attendees in silk gowns and military uniforms dancing to orchestras under candlelit domes. This glittering facade masked a society on the brink of collapse, where the vast majority of Russia's 125 million subjects endured grinding poverty. Peasants toiled on feudal estates, workers in emerging factories faced 14-hour days for meager wages, and serfdom had only been abolished in 1861, leaving deep resentments. Intellectuals and revolutionaries inspired by Marxist ideas and Western liberalism agitated for change while famines and industrial strikes fueled unrest. The empire's autocratic structure, resistant to reform, created a powder keg with the winds of revolution already beginning to howl in the form of assassinations and uprisings. At the heart of this turbulent realm stood Olga's father, Tsar Alexander III, a towering figure both literally and figuratively. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches with a broad, muscular build, he embodied the archetype of the Russian bear, physically imposing, fiercely autocratic, and unyielding in his belief that his power derived directly from God. Ascending the throne in 1881 after his father's assassination, Alexander III reversed many liberal reforms of Alexander II, strengthening censorship, suppressing dissent through the Okhrana secret police, and promoting Russification policies that marginalized ethnic minorities like Poles, Jews, and Finns. His reign was marked by a reactionary conservatism, exemplified by his motto, autocracy, orthodoxy, nationality, which aimed to unify the empire under traditional values, but alienated modernizers. Yet beneath this iron facade lurked a constant gnawing fear. Alexander III ruled in the shadow of violence, haunted by the knowledge that revolutionaries viewed the Romanovs as symbols of oppression. This paranoia was not unfounded. Just a year before Olga's birth, on June 13, 1882, at Peterhof Palace, her grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, known as the Tsar Liberator for emancipating the serfs, had been blown to pieces by a revolutionary's bomb on the streets of St. Petersburg. Petersburg on March 13, 1881. The People's Will, a radical group, had hurled explosives at his carriage, severing his legs and causing fatal injuries. This assassination sent shockwaves through the royal family, prompting Alexander III to retreat from public life and fortify his residences. For Olga, born into this atmosphere of dread, the event cast a long shadow, instilling an early awareness of vulnerability that would recur throughout her life, from the 1905 revolution to her exile in 1920. Analyzing Olga's upbringing at Gatchina reveals a profound paradox that molded her resilient yet pragmatic character. While immersed in unimaginable wealth, the palace boasted marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, and art collections. The imperial children's daily life was one of strict, almost Spartan, discipline. Alexander III, recalling his own neglected childhood under tutors, was determined to raise his offspring without spoiling them, instilling values of humility and duty. Olga and her siblings slept on hard camp cots, were awakened at dawn for ice-cold baths to build fortitude, and ate simple plain porridge for breakfast, eschewing the lavish feasts of court life. Toys were tidied away each evening, and they were expected to be polite, quiet, and unobtrusive, with education conducted by private tutors in history, languages, Russian, English, French, mathematics, and arts. Physical activities like riding and dancing were mandatory, fostering discipline, while religious observance was rigorous. Lent meant no meat or dairy, and Easter involved elaborate but solemn rituals. This regimen, overseen by an English nanny, Elizabeth Franklin, contrasted sharply with the empire's excesses, teaching Olga early lessons in restraint. Central to Olga's emotional world was her relationship with her parents, a dynamic of contrast that profoundly influenced her personality. With her mother, Empress Marie Feodorovna, born Princess Dagmar of Denmark, the bond was often distant and formal. Marie, glamorous and socially adept, prioritized court duties and her older children, leaving Olga feeling overlooked. Raised in a lively Danish court, Marie brought elegance to Russia, but struggled with the isolation of Gatchina, focusing on charitable patronages and balls rather than intimate parenting. Olga's memoirs describe this as a strained and distant connection from childhood, persisting into adulthood, where Marie disapproved of Olga's second marriage and lifestyle choices. This emotional gap may have fostered Olga's independence as she sought fulfillment elsewhere, but it also left scars of insecurity, evident in her later depressions and desire for authentic relationships. In stark contrast, Olga adored her formidable father, Alexander III, who was the center of her world. As his darling and youngest daughter, she enjoyed a privileged closeness, often joining him and brother Michael for activities that humanized the Tsar. Despite his autocratic duties, signing decrees and hosting receptions at Gatchina, he spared daily time for her, sharing a secret world away from court formalities. He revealed his private sketchbooks, filled with whimsical pen and ink drawings of an imaginary city called Mopsopolis, populated entirely by pugs in a pug army, complete with uniforms and hierarchies, a playful relic from his own childhood that delighted Olga. "My father was everything to me," she recalled. Immersed in work as he was, he always spared that daily half hour. Once my father showed me a very old album full of most exciting pen and ink sketches of an imaginary city called Mopsopolis, inhabited by mopses. He showed it to me in secret, and I was thrilled to have him share his own childhood secrets with me. These moments highlighted Alexander's softer side, contrasting his public image as a stern ruler. Further bonding occurred during long walks in Gachina's vast forests, where he taught Olga practical skills, building campfires, cooking over open flames, and foraging for mushrooms, lessons in self-reliance that echoed his own rugged upbringing. In these interludes, he wasn't the feared autocrat of all the Russias, but a loving father, providing Olga with rare glimpses of normalcy. Family holidays reinforced this. Summers at Peterhof or visits to Danish grandparents offered respite, though security loomed. Analyzing this paternal bond, it instilled in Olga a sense of security and moral grounding, shaping her as a compassionate figure who valued simplicity. Biographers note it contrasted with Nicholas II's more formal parenting, influencing Olga's role as a doting aunt to his children. However, it also heightened her vulnerability. Losing this anchor at age 12 would leave a void, contributing to her lifelong quest for emotional stability. This idyllic bubble burst in a terrifying ordeal when Olga was just 6 years old, an event that crystallized the precariousness of Romanov life. On October 29, 1888, old-style October 17th, the imperial family was traveling on the royal train from Crimea back to St. Petersburg via the Kursk-Kharkov-Azov Railroad, near Borky Station 295 kilometers south of Kursk. The train, comprising 15 carriages with 64 axles exceeding safety limits, derailed at 60 kilometers per hour while climbing a ravine. The family was lunching in the dining car when it lurched violently, tearing apart. The heavy iron roof caved in, wheels and floor were sliced off, and carriages piled into wreckage. Olga later recalled the horrifying sensation of being thrown through the air amid smashing glass and twisted metal. 23 died, 21 at the scene 2 later, with 35 injured. In a legendary feat, Alexander III braced his shoulders against the collapsing roof, holding it up long enough for his family to escape unharmed, though this strained his kidneys, contributing to his later illness. Empress Marie tore her clothes into bandages for the wounded, displaying composure amid chaos. The official investigation, led by Anatoly Kony with Sergei Vita and Viktor Kirpichev, attributed it to speeding 67 kilometers per hour on faulty track, overload, and substandard construction, rotten wooden ties, and inadequate ballast. However, dark rumors swirled immediately. The Romanovs had countless enemies, from Narodnaya Volya revolutionaries to disgruntled nobles, and many believed it was a deliberate assassination attempt via bombs or sabotage. Given the family's survival was hailed as miraculous, churches like Foros and Borky Cathedral were built in commemoration, and icons depicted divine intervention. For little Olga, the trauma of Borky, witnessing death and her father's heroism, cemented a lifelong feeling of precariousness. She learned early that being a Romanov meant being a target, fostering a cautious worldview that prepared her for future upheavals like the 1917 revolution. This event also amplified family bonds as survival was seen as God's grace, reinforcing Olga's Orthodox faith. But a far greater tragedy loomed, shattering Olga's world irrevocably. When she was just 12, her giant of a father, the man she believed could hold up the world, fell gravely ill with nephritis, exacerbated by the Borky strain and his robust lifestyle. In 1894, the family canceled their Danish trip as his condition worsened at Levadia Palace in Crimea. He died on November 1st, old-style October 20th, at age 49, in Marie's arms. Olga was utterly devastated. "I felt as if the sun had gone out of my world forever," she wrote, capturing the depth of her loss. With his passing, her anchor vanished, and her brother Nicholas became Tsar Nicholas II, inheriting an empire in crisis. Olga later opined he was ill-prepared for the role, reflecting her insight into the family's vulnerabilities. This bereavement marked the end of her childhood innocence, steering her toward a life of duty, unhappiness in marriage, and eventual heroism. Analyzing its impact, father's death instilled in Olga a sense of impermanence, fueling her resilience, seen in her nursing and exile survival, but also a melancholic pragmatism as she navigated the Romanov downfall with quiet strength, a marriage of misery. In the midst of this personal turmoil, Olga received an unexpected marriage proposal from Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg, a distant cousin 14 years her senior. At 32, Peter was an unlikely suitor. Known for his intellectual pursuits and penchant for gambling, he lacked the charisma or warmth that might have endeared him to Olga. His reputation was further complicated by widespread rumors about his sexuality. Many in the Russian court believed Peter was homosexual, a suspicion fueled by his apparent lack of interest in women and his aloof demeanor. Some speculated that his ambitious mother, eager to secure a closer connection to the imperial family, had orchestrated the proposal. For Olga, however, the motivations behind Peter's offer were secondary to the opportunity it presented, a chance to escape her mother's domineering influence. The Russian court was stunned by the proposal. The age gap, Peter's questionable reputation, and Olga's status as a Grand Duchess made the match seem improbable. Yet Olga, driven by her desire for independence, accepted. Her decision was not rooted in affection or even familiarity. Peter was a virtual stranger to her, but in a desperate bid for freedom. She saw marriage as a way to carve out her own space, away from the suffocating control of the Dowager Empress. In her naivety, Olga believed that even a loveless marriage would grant her the autonomy she craved. She could not have been more wrong. The wedding, held in 1901, was a grand affair befitting a Romanov, but the facade of celebration masked the grim reality that awaited Olga. The wedding night set the tone for the marriage's failure. After the ceremony, Peter abandoned Olga in their bridal suite, choosing instead to spend the night at a gambling club. He did not return until dawn, leaving Olga alone to grapple with the realization of her mistake. The young bride, barely 18, spent the night in tears, overwhelmed by the loneliness and rejection that would define their relationship. This abandonment was not a one-time lapse, but a harbinger of the emotional neglect that would characterize their marriage. The marriage was never consummated, a fact Olga later confirmed with stark candor in her memoirs. I shared his roof for nearly 15 years, and never once were we husband and wife. The absence of physical intimacy was compounded by an emotional chasm that grew wider with each passing day. Peter's indifference to Olga was palpable, and his priorities lay elsewhere, primarily in satisfying his gambling addiction. Olga's substantial dowry, a fortune that should have secured her financial independence, became a resource for Peter to plunder. He siphoned off her wealth to settle his mounting debts, leaving Olga feeling exploited and powerless. The betrayal was not just personal but financial, as her inheritance meant to provide security was squandered on Peter's vices. The couple's honeymoon in Biarritz, a fashionable resort town known for its spas and casinos, was meant to be a glamorous escape. Instead, it became another chapter in their saga of misfortune. A fire broke out in their hotel, forcing a hasty evacuation and adding to Olga's sense of instability. The incident, while not life-threatening, underscored the chaos that seemed to follow the couple. Biarritz, with its glittering casinos, only deepened Peter's obsession with gambling, further alienating Olga. The lavish wedding gifts they received, a private yacht for a trip to Italy, a 200-room mansion in St. Petersburg, offered no solace. These symbols of wealth and status felt like cruel reminders of the happiness Olga could not attain. The St. Petersburg mansion, a wedding gift of staggering opulence, became a gilded cage. Its vastness only highlighted the emotional distance between Olga and Peter. Determined to carve out a space of her own, Olga insisted that her personal apartments, including her cherished art studio, be located at the far end of the mansion, 198 rooms away from Peter's chambers. This physical separation mirrored the irreparable divide in their relationship. The art studio became Olga's sanctuary, a place where she could retreat into her painting and find fleeting moments of peace. Yet even this refuge could not shield her from the toll of her circumstances. The misery of Olga's marriage manifested in devastating physical and emotional consequences. In the early years of their union, she sank into a deep depression, a condition exacerbated by the isolation and rejection she experienced. The stress was so severe that it triggered a shocking physical symptom. Her hair began to fall out in clumps. For 2 years, Olga was completely bald, forced to wear a wig to conceal her condition from the prying eyes of the court. This secret shame compounded her sense of vulnerability, as she maintained a public facade of composure while privately grappling with despair. The loss of her hair was not just a physical ailment, but a symbol of the erosion of Olga's identity. As a Grand Duchess, she was expected to embody grace and beauty, yet her private suffering stripped her of this image. The wig, a necessity to preserve appearances, became a daily reminder of her inner turmoil. Her depression was not merely a reaction to her husband's neglect, but a response to the broader constraints of her life. The loss of her father, her strained relationship with her mother, and the suffocating expectations of the Russian court. Marriage, which she had hoped would be a path to freedom, had instead deepened her sense of entrapment. To cope with her desolation, Olga sought refuge in meaningful pursuits. She channeled her energy and resources into philanthropy, using her personal wealth to establish an estate called Olgino, near her mother-in-law's palace in Ramon. This project became a lifeline, offering her a sense of purpose that her marriage lacked. At Olgino, she oversaw the construction of a village hospital, funded a local school, and immersed herself in community welfare. These endeavors were not mere acts of charity, but a deliberate attempt to reclaim agency in a life that felt increasingly out of her control. Recognizing the practical value of medical knowledge, Olga undertook training in nursing and basic medical procedures. She learned to set bones, dress wounds, and care for patients, skills that would later prove invaluable during World War I. This training was both a distraction and a source of empowerment, allowing her to step beyond the ornamental role of a Grand Duchess and engage in work that had tangible impact. Her commitment to medicine reflected a desire to contribute to the world in a way that her marriage could not. Despite their estrangement, Olga and Peter found an unlikely point of connection in wolf hunting, a pursuit that was both thrilling and brutal. The Russian aristocracy often engaged in hunting as a display of prowess, and for Olga, it offered a rare opportunity to share an activity with her husband. The adrenaline of the hunt, the vastness of the Russian wilderness, and the temporary camaraderie it fostered provided a fleeting respite from their otherwise fractured relationship. Yet this shared interest could not bridge the fundamental disconnect between them. Wolf hunting was a momentary distraction, not a foundation for intimacy. As a Grand Duchess, Olga was expected to maintain the appearance of a successful marriage, a task that required immense emotional fortitude. The Russian court was a hotbed of gossip, and the peculiarities of her marriage to Peter were no secret. Whispers about his gambling, his rumored homosexuality, and the couple's lack of intimacy circulated widely, adding to Olga's humiliation. Yet she bore these indignities with stoic resolve, attending public functions and upholding her duties as a member of the imperial family. Her ability to compartmentalize her private pain while presenting a composed exterior was a testament to her resilience, but it came at a cost. The public scrutiny intensified Olga's sense of isolation. She was surrounded by courtiers and servants, yet she felt profoundly alone. Her mother, the Dowager Empress, offered little sympathy, viewing Olga's dissatisfaction as a failure to uphold her responsibilities. The absence of familial support left Olga to navigate her misery and solitude, relying on her own inner strength to endure. Her art studio remained a vital outlet where she could express emotions that had no place in the rigid world of the court. Painting allowed her to process her grief, anger, and longing, preserving a fragment of her identity amid the chaos of her marriage. As the years passed, Olga's desperation for escape grew. Her marriage to Peter was not just a personal failure, but a symbol of the broader constraints imposed on her as a woman in the Russian imperial system. The realization that she had traded one form of captivity for another fueled a quiet rebellion within her. This restlessness would eventually lead her to Nikolai Kulikovsky, a commoner who captured her heart and offered the possibility of genuine love. However, her attempts to seek a divorce were thwarted by both Peter, who relied on her wealth, and her brother, Tsar Nicholas II, who upheld the sanctity of marriage and dismissed Kulikovsky as an unsuitable match, a forbidden love. In the gilded yet suffocating world of the Russian imperial court at the turn of the 20th century, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna of Russia found herself ensnared in a marriage that offered no emotional fulfillment, only the trappings of status and wealth. Her union with Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg, arranged more for convenience than affection, had left her in a state of quiet desperation for years. It was against this backdrop of marital disillusionment that a transformative encounter occurred, one that would ignite a passion Olga had never known and challenge the rigid hierarchies of her world. The introduction came through her beloved brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, the youngest sibling in the Romanov family, and a figure who often bridged the gap between Olga's sheltered life and the broader military circles of the empire. Michael, known for his adventurous spirit and close bond with Olga, arranged for her to meet a young cavalry officer serving in the elite Blue Cuirassier Guards, a prestigious regiment that fell under Olga's personal patronage as a Grand Duchess. This patronage was not merely ceremonial. It involved Olga attending reviews, parades, and events where she could observe and interact with the officers, fostering a sense of connection to the military traditions of Russia. The officer's name was Nikolai Alexandrovich Kulikovsky, a man of modest origins born in 1881 to a family of minor nobility in Ukraine. Unlike the princes and dukes who populated Olga's social sphere, Kulikovsky was essentially a commoner in the eyes of the imperial family. No title of Grand Duke or foreign royalty adorned his name, only the rank earned through service and merit in the cavalry. Their first meeting unfolded during a grand military review at Pavlovsk Palace in the spring of 1903, a spectacle of pomp and precision typical of the Romanov era. As the Blue Cuirassiers paraded across the grounds, their uniforms gleaming under the sun, Olga's gaze locked with Nikolai's from afar. In that fleeting moment, amid the thunder of hooves and the crisp commands of officers, something profound shifted within her. Historians and biographers drawing from Olga's own memoirs dictated later in life to Ian Voris, described this as an instantaneous and overwhelming attraction. Olga herself recalled the encounter with vivid clarity, the way Nikolai's steady eyes met hers, conveying a quiet strength and sincerity that contrasted sharply with the superficiality of court life. It was not merely physical allure, though Nikolai was undeniably handsome, with a tall, athletic build, honed by years of cavalry training, but a deeper resonance. For Olga, who had endured a loveless marriage where intimacy was absent and emotional voids were filled only by her artistic pursuits and charitable works, this connection felt like a revelation. It was love at first sight, a rare and genuine spark in a life dictated by protocol and expectation. The immediacy of their bond was astonishing. Within days of that initial meeting, Olga and Nikolai began exchanging letters, a discreet yet intimate form of communication that allowed them to share thoughts, dreams, and affections away from prying eyes. These early correspondences, though not preserved in full, are referenced in Olga's recollections as tender and revealing, building a foundation of mutual understanding. Nikolai, educated and cultured despite his non-aristocratic background, impressed Olga with his intelligence, humility, and devotion to duty. He was not a fortune seeker or social climber. His affection for her appeared pure, untainted by the ambitions that often poisoned relationships in the imperial circle. For Olga, this was liberating. At 21 years old, she had already experienced the hollowness of her marriage to Peter, where nights were spent alone and days were marked by his absences at gambling tables or in the company of others. Nikolai represented an escape, a chance at authentic companionship. Emboldened by this newfound emotion, Olga took a step that was radical for a woman of her station. She confronted her husband with a direct request for divorce. This occurred mere weeks after meeting Nikolai, underscoring the depth of her conviction. In the rigidly conservative Russian Orthodox society, divorce was not only frowned upon, but actively discouraged, especially among the royalty, where marriages were seen as indissoluble bonds sanctified by God and the Church. Peter's response was cold and calculated. He refused outright, citing no particular affection for Olga, but rather the practical benefits of their union, her substantial fortune, inherited from her father Tsar Alexander III, which funded his lifestyle and indulgences. In a moment of cynical pragmatism, Peter suggested he might reconsider her plea in 7 years, a delay that seemed arbitrary yet cruel, prolonging Olga's misery while securing his financial stability. This refusal was not just a personal rejection, but a reflection of the patriarchal structures of the time, where women's desires were secondary to familial and societal obligations. Undeterred, Olga escalated her plea to the highest authority in her world, her brother, Tsar Nicholas II. As the autocratic ruler of Russia and head of the Romanov family, Nicholas held the power to intervene in such matters, potentially annulling the marriage through imperial decree. Olga approached him with hope, appealing to their close sibling bond forged in childhood at Gatchina Palace. However, Nicholas, a devout Orthodox Christian who viewed marriage as a sacred lifelong commitment, denied her request. His reasoning was twofold. First, the sanctity of matrimony, which he upheld rigorously in his own life with Tsarina Alexandra. Second, the unsuitability of Nikolai as a match for a Grand Duchess. Kulikovsky's commoner status was an insurmountable barrier in Nicholas's eyes. The Romanovs married within circles of European royalty or high nobility to preserve bloodlines and alliances. A union with a mere officer would dilute the family's prestige and invite scandal. Olga was once again trapped, her heart divided between duty and desire in a forbidden love that society and family deemed impossible. Olga witnessed the terror in her brother's eyes during Alexei's episodes, where even a bruise could lead to internal bleeding and excruciating pain. She offered quiet support, helping with care when possible and praying for his recovery, all while grappling with the helplessness that gripped the family. This familial devotion intersected tragically with Olga's growing alarm over Tsarina Alexandra's reliance on Grigory Rasputin, the enigmatic Siberian mystic who entered the Romanov inner circle around 1905. Rasputin, a self-proclaimed holy man with a reputation for healing through prayer, appeared to alleviate Alexei's symptoms during crises, earning Alexandra's unwavering trust. Desperate to save her son, the heir to the throne, Alexandra elevated Rasputin to a position of undue influence, consulting him on state matters and defending him against critics. Olga, however, was deeply unnerved by him. In her memoirs, she recounted personal encounters where Rasputin made inappropriate advances, his leering gaze and crude manners filling her with disgust. She viewed him as a manipulative charlatan, exploiting the family's vulnerability for personal gain and power. Rasputin's hypnotic hold over Alexandra, combined with his scandalous behavior, drunken orgies, and political meddling, eroded public trust in the monarchy at a critical juncture. Olga's private worries about Rasputin were profound. She saw his influence as a cancer on the dynasty, accelerating the discontent brewing in Russia amid the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, Bloody Sunday, 1905, and rising revolutionary sentiments. Though she never confronted Alexandra directly, knowing the Tsarina's defensiveness would only strain relations, Olga confided her fears to Nikolai, who shared her skepticism. This period of forbidden love thus became intertwined with Olga's broader concerns for her family's future. Nikolai's steady presence provided emotional anchorage, allowing her to navigate the court's intrigues and the looming shadows of war and revolution, the world on fire. In the early years of the 20th century, the Russian Empire, once a bastion of autocratic power and imperial grandeur, began to fracture under the weight of internal contradictions, social unrest, and external pressures. For Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, this period marked a profound transformation from the insulated world of royal privilege to one fraught with personal peril, emotional turmoil, and eventual purpose amid catastrophe. The rumblings of revolution, which had simmered beneath the surface since the humiliating Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, grew louder and more insistent, manifesting in strikes, protests, and violent clashes that directly encroached upon the imperial family's sense of security. Olga, who had already endured a loveless marriage and the quiet desperation of unfulfilled affection, found herself increasingly confronted by the harsh realities of a nation on the brink. This era, often characterized as a prelude to the cataclysmic events of 1917, exposed the fragility of the Romanov dynasty and forced Olga to grapple with fears that extended far beyond her personal life. The year 1905 stands as a pivotal turning point, a time when the illusion of imperial invincibility was irrevocably shattered. Russia was reeling from defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which had exposed the inefficiencies of the Tsarist regime, including outdated military strategies, corruption in the bureaucracy, and widespread discontent among the peasantry and working classes. Economic hardships, exacerbated by poor harvests and industrial strikes, fueled demands for reform including constitutional changes and better labor conditions. Against this backdrop, Olga experienced the terror of revolution firsthand during a stay at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Petersburg, the opulent seat of Romanov power, symbolizing centuries of autocratic rule. The palace, with its vast halls adorned in gold and crystal, had long been a sanctuary for the family, but in January 1905, it became a target. On January 22, 1905, January 9th in the old-style calendar, a crowd of peaceful protesters, led by the Orthodox priest Father Georgy Gapon, marched toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. The petitioners, numbering in the tens of thousands and including workers, women, and children, carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, singing hymns in a display of loyalty mixed with desperation. They sought redress for grievances, such as higher wages, shorter working hours, and an end to the war. However, Nicholas was not at the palace. He had retreated to Tsarskoye Selo, leaving the city under the command of nervous troops. In a tragic miscalculation, the soldiers opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. Estimates range from 92 to over 1,000 dead, and wounding thousands more in what became infamously known as Bloody Sunday. This massacre, far from quelling dissent, ignited widespread strikes, peasant uprisings, and mutinies across the empire, marking the onset of the 1905 Russian Revolution. Olga was not directly present at the Bloody Sunday massacre, but the event's shockwaves reached her profoundly, amplifying her growing awareness of the regime's vulnerabilities. Just weeks earlier, on Epiphany Day, January 19, 1905, revolutionaries had fired live rounds at the Winter Palace from the nearby Peter and Paul Fortress, shattering windows and sending shards of glass flying into the grand halls, where Olga and her mother, Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, were staying. Olga later recounted in her memoirs, as dictated to biographer Ian Voretsky, the sheer terror of that moment. Standing in one of the palace's ornate rooms, she heard the crack of gunfire and felt the impact as bullets pierced the glass, raining fragments around her. Miraculously unharmed, she was nonetheless deeply shaken, the incident serving as a stark reminder that the Romanovs were no longer safe even within their fortified residences. This attack, though less documented than Bloody Sunday, underscored the revolutionaries' boldness and the family's isolation from the populace's grievances. Olga's personal reaction, as analyzed through her recollections, revealed a mix of fear and disillusionment. She had grown up in the relative security of Gatchina Palace, shielded from threats after her grandfather Alexander II's assassination in 1881. But now the violence was inescapable. The Bloody Sunday aftermath intensified Olga's exposure to the revolution's chaos. Strikes paralyzed industries, peasants burned manor houses, and parts of the Navy mutinied, most notably on the battleship Potemkin. The Tsar responded with the October Manifesto granting limited civil liberties and establishing the Duma, but these concessions came too late to stem the tide of radicalism. For Olga, the events of 1905 were not abstract. They intruded into her family circle with brutal immediacy. Just a month after Bloody Sunday on February 17, 1905, her uncle Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, Governor-General of Moscow and husband to her Aunt Elizabeth, Ella, was assassinated by a bomb thrown by revolutionary Ivan Kalyayev. Sergei, known for his conservative policies and harsh suppression of dissent, was a prime target. The explosion tore him apart in the Kremlin, leaving Olga and the family in mourning and heightening their paranoia about further attacks. Olga, who had a close relationship with her extended family, felt the loss acutely. It reinforced her private worries about the monarchy's sustainability, though she remained loyal to her brother Nicholas. The following years, from 1906 to 1914, were a blur of political instability, sporadic riots, and a series of assassinations that further eroded the Romanov regime's stability. Russia attempted reforms under Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, appointed in 1906, who implemented agrarian changes to appease peasants and suppressed revolutionaries through harsh measures, including summary executions via Stolypin neckties, hangings. Olga supported Stolypin's gradualist approach, viewing it as a sensible path to modernization without radical upheaval. The assassin, Dmitry Bogrov, a revolutionary with ties to the secret police, fired at point-blank range and Stolypin died days later. Olga, who respected him as a stabilizing force, was devastated. This assassination, witnessed indirectly through family accounts, symbolized the regime's inability to protect even its key reformers. The sense of impending doom was palpable as Olga navigated court life amid growing isolation of the Tsar from his people, exacerbated by Rasputin's influence and the hemophilia crisis of her nephew Alexei. By 1912, the accumulated stress of these events, coupled with her ongoing marital unhappiness and the scandal of her affection for Nikolai Kulikovsky, culminated in a severe nervous breakdown during a trip to England with her mother, Dowager Empress Marie. The visit, intended as a respite, instead amplified Olga's emotional fragility. England, with its constitutional monarchy and relative stability, contrasted sharply with Russia's turmoil, perhaps heightening her anxiety. Tsarina Alexandra's own fatigue from Alexei's health issues meant Olga had to stand in for public duties, adding to her burden. Her breakdown manifested as overwhelming exhaustion, anxiety, and possibly depression, forcing her to seek rest. In her memoirs, Olga attributed it partly to the public unrest and family strains, including her brother Michael's morganatic marriage in 1912, which further divided the Romanovs. This episode highlighted Olga's vulnerability. As a Grand Duchess, she was expected to embody stoicism, but the psychological toll of witnessing assassinations and revolutions proved overwhelming. Recovery was gradual, aided by Kulikovsky's support through letters, underscoring how her forbidden love served as an emotional anchor amid chaos. Then in 1914, the world exploded with the outbreak of World War I, a conflict that would prove the death knell for Imperial Russia. Triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, the war drew Russia into an alliance with Serbia against Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. Initially, it sparked a wave of patriotic fervor, with crowds cheering Nicholas in St. Petersburg and volunteers flocking to enlist. For the Romanovs, it offered a brief unity, but the immense slaughter, millions dead in trench warfare, and hardships like food shortages and economic strain soon broke the nation's back. Russia's ill-prepared army suffered devastating losses, such as at Tannenberg in August 1914, eroding faith in the Tsar, who assumed personal command in 1915, linking military failures directly to him. For Olga, however, the war provided a renewed sense of purpose, transforming her from a sidelined royal into an active participant in the national effort. Drawing on her earlier nursing training from charitable work at her Ogino estate, where she had established a hospital and learned basic medical skills, she immediately volunteered as a Red Cross nurse. Refusing to be a mere ceremonial figurehead, as many aristocratic women were, Olga established a military hospital at Ogino and worked tirelessly on the front lines. She began at an understaffed Red Cross facility in Rovno, now Rivne, Ukraine, near her patron regiment, the Akhtirsky Hussars, where Kulikovsky served. As the war progressed, she moved to field hospitals closer to the Austrian front, enduring harrowing conditions, mud-filled trenches, constant shelling, and the screams of the wounded. Olga's role was hands-on and perilous. She dressed wounds, administered morphine, comforted dying soldiers, and assisted in amputations under primitive conditions, often without adequate supplies or sanitation. Nurses rarely ventured so near the fighting, but Olga insisted, driven by a sense of duty and empathy for the common soldiers, whom she saw as extensions of her beloved Russia. During one intense engagement on the southwestern front in 1915, Austrian troops overran her position, and she was violently thrown into a ditch by an explosion's blast wave. Pulled out shaken but alive, she continued her work, her courage inspiring those around her. For this extraordinary bravery and service, General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a Finnish officer in the Russian army, later president of Finland, awarded her the Order of St. George, one of Russia's highest military honors, typically reserved for combat valor. This rare distinction for a woman underscored Olga's exceptional role. The order, established in 1769, symbolized gallantry, and her receipt of it elevated her status beyond royal lineage to that of a national heroine. Analyzing Olga's wartime service reveals a multifaceted character, compassionate yet resilient, defying gender norms in a patriarchal society. Her nursing was not performative. It stemmed from genuine humanitarianism honed by years of charity work and provided an outlet for the frustrations of her personal life. The war's brutal reminders of life's fragility, witnessing young men die from gangrene or shell shock, profoundly affected her, fostering a deeper appreciation for human connections, including her bond with Kulikovsky, who fought on the front lines. As Russian forces retreated eastward, her hospital relocated to Kiev in 1915, where she continued amid growing anti-Tsarist sentiment fueled by defeats and Rasputin's scandals. The war's chaos, with its daily affirmations of mortality, finally granted Olga her deepest wish. Witnessing her courage and dedication firsthand during a visit to Kiev in 1916, and perhaps recognizing that traditional rules held little sway in a crumbling world, her brother Tsar Nicholas II relented on his previous objections. On October 16, 1916, October 4th OS, he officially annulled her marriage to Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg, a union that had been unconsummated and unhappy for 15 years. The annulment, sanctioned by the Orthodox Church and imperial decree, freed Olga from the facade she had maintained since 1901. 2 months later, on November 16, 1916, November 3rd OS, in a small church in Kiev, the Kievo-Vasilievskaya Church, Olga Alexandrovna, Grand Duchess of Russia, married Nikolai Kulikovsky, the commoner cavalry officer she had loved and waited for over 13 years. The ceremony was simple and quiet, attended by only a handful, including Dowager Empress Marie, and a few close associates, far removed from the pomp of court weddings. At age 34, after enduring revolutions, assassinations, a breakdown, and wartime horrors, Olga had finally found personal happiness. Yet this joy was fragile and fleeting, secured mere months before the February Revolution of 1917 swept away the Romanov world forever. Flight and exile, the culmination of Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna's long-awaited personal happiness with her second husband, Colonel Nikolai Kulikovsky, proved heartbreakingly ephemeral, enduring for a mere 5 months after their modest wedding in November 1916. By early 1917, the Russian Empire had reached a catastrophic breaking point, its foundations eroded by years of military debacles in World War I, acute food shortages that left urban populations starving, rampant inflation, and a profound seething resentment toward the autocratic monarchy. These factors converged into a full-blown revolution that began in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, in February 1917, triggered by strikes and demonstrations over bread rations and war weariness. The unrest rapidly escalated, with soldiers mutinying and joining protesters, forcing Tsar Nicholas II, Olga's beloved brother, to abdicate on March 15, 1917, March 2nd in the old-style calendar, thereby ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule and ushering in the provisional government. This abdication, signed aboard a train at Pskov, marked not only the collapse of an empire, but the abrupt transformation of Olga's status from the privileged sister of the Tsar to a potential enemy of the nascent revolutionary state, vulnerable to the whims of radical factions. In an instant, Olga's life shifted from one of relative security amid wartime service to grave peril, as the revolution's waves swept across the country, targeting symbols of the old regime. With her husband Nikolai and a small retinue of loyal servants and guards, she fled southward to Crimea, a picturesque Black Sea peninsula that had long served as a traditional seaside refuge for the Romanovs, dotted with imperial estates like Levadia and Todor. This flight was not a leisurely retreat, but a desperate evacuation, undertaken amid chaos, as Bolshevik influence grew following the October Revolution in November 1917, which overthrew the provisional government and installed Vladimir Lenin's Soviet regime. Joining Olga in Crimea were her mother, the Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, her sister Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna, Xenia's husband Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, and various other relatives and retainers, forming a precarious enclave of exiled royalty. However, the anticipated sanctuary proved illusory. Local revolutionary councils known as Soviets, particularly the militant Yalta Soviet, swiftly seized control of the region, imposing strict surveillance and restrictions on the Romanovs. Olga and her companions were placed under house arrest at Todor, one of the imperial estates near Yalta, transforming the once idyllic villa into a gilded prison. Armed guards patrolled the grounds, monitoring their every move, while the family subsisted on meager rations and lived in constant fear of arbitrary violence. This period of captivity was marked by profound uncertainty, as news from the mainland trickled in sporadically, painting a grim picture of civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-communist White forces. Olga's personal experiences during this time, as recounted in her memoirs dictated to biographer Ian Voris, reveal a woman grappling with terror yet maintaining a stoic facade for her family's sake. She described the atmosphere as one of suffocating dread, where simple acts like walking in the gardens required permission, and whispers of executions elsewhere amplified their anxiety. Analyzing her resilience here, Olga's background as a frontline nurse during the World War I, where she had faced bombardments and the horrors of wounded soldiers, likely fortified her mentally, allowing her to focus on practical survival rather than despair. Yet the psychological toll was immense. She was not just a prisoner, but a new mother navigating motherhood under duress. It was in this state of terrifying uncertainty that Olga gave birth to her first child on August 12, 1917, a son they named Tikhon Nikolaevich in honor of St. Tikhon of Zadonsk, a nod to their Orthodox faith amid adversity. The delivery occurred at Itador, assisted by a local midwife under rudimentary conditions, far removed from the royal pomp that had attended her own birth at Peterhof Palace. Holding her newborn while guards loomed outside, Olga embodied the stark contrast between her imperial heritage and her reduced circumstances. Tikhon's arrival brought fleeting joy but heightened vulnerability. As a Romanov heir, even an infant, he was a potential target. Meanwhile, the local Soviet debated their fate with chilling deliberation. In February 1918, the Yalta Soviet, under the influence of radical Bolsheviks like Janis Jukums, known as Zakis, condemned the entire Romanov contingent in Crimea, including Olga, Nikolai, Tikhon, the Dowager Empress, and others, to death by execution. This sentence, rooted in the revolutionary zeal to eradicate Tsarist remnants, reflected the broader Red Terror that would claim thousands of lives. Their lives were spared only by a bizarre twist of fate, intertwined with the geopolitical upheavals of World War I and the Russian Civil War. As Russia descended into full-scale civil war, with white armies clashing against Reds, German forces, still technically at war with Russia under the Central Powers, advanced into Ukraine and occupied Crimea in April 1918, following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which had ceded vast territories to Germany. The German troops under Kaiser Wilhelm II, a cousin to Nicholas II, replaced the Revolutionary Guards at Itador with their own, providing a temporary buffer against Bolshevik extremism. In the ensuing political chaos, the authority of the local Soviet fragmented, and the death sentence was effectively forgotten or postponed amid rivalries between the Yalta and Sevastopol Soviets, who argued over jurisdiction, a bureaucratic squabble that inadvertently saved the group. The Germans, respecting the Romanovs' royal blood ties, allowed the surviving members of the imperial family greater freedoms and eventually facilitated evacuation options as the war turned against them. It was during this period of uneasy captivity that the most devastating news reached Olga, shattering her world irreparably. Rumors, followed by fragmented reports from White Army sources and foreign diplomats, confirmed the worst. Her brother Nicholas, along with his wife Alexandra and their 5 children, including Olga's cherished goddaughter and niece, Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, had been murdered by Bolshevik forces in Ekaterinburg on July 17, 1918. There was no official word initially on the family's fate, as the Bolsheviks suppressed details to avoid international outrage, but Olga instinctively knew they were all gone, an intuition born from the regime's ruthless patterns. The loss was incomprehensible, plunging her into profound grief. In her memoirs, she wrote, "The horror of it all was beyond belief, capturing the raw anguish of losing not just siblings, but the symbolic heart of her family." Analyzing this moment, Olga's reaction reveals layers of trauma, survivor's guilt, as one of the few Romanovs to escape, maternal protectiveness, fearing for her own sons, and a philosophical reckoning with the end of an era. Her bond with Anastasia, whom she nicknamed Schwipsik, and spoiled with stories and outings, made the presumed death particularly agonizing, fueling later hopes and disappointments regarding imposters like Anna Anderson. Despite the mortal danger enveloping them, with Bolshevik advances threatening to reclaim Crimea, Olga initially refused to leave her homeland. Russia, for all its turmoil and betrayal, remained her country, imbued with memories of childhood at Gatchina, familial bonds, and a deep-seated patriotism forged through her wartime nursing. Pregnant with her second child, she and Nikolai sought refuge in the Caucasus region, a rugged area in southern Russia, where white army forces under General Anton Denikin held temporary sway against the Reds. They moved to the Stanitsa, Cossack village, of Novominskaya near Kuban, living incognito as simple peasants in a rented farmhouse owned by one of Nikolai's loyal friends from his military days. This relocation in late 1918, after the Germans withdrew from Crimea following their defeat in World War I, was a calculated risk, betting on white protection. Olga's memoirs describe this interlude as one of austere simplicity, tending gardens, baking bread, and evading detection, a far cry from her pre-revolutionary life of palaces and patronage. There, in the modest farmhouse amid the Cossack steppes, Olga gave birth to her second son, Guri Nikolaevich, on April 23, 1919, April 10th Old Style, assisted by a local peasant woman rather than royal physicians. Named after a saint, Guri's arrival symbolized hope but also underscored the perils of their situation. The civil war raged nearby, with Bolshevik incursions threatening encirclement. The reality of holding a vulnerable newborn in the middle of a brutal civil war, characterized by atrocities on both sides, including mass executions and famines, finally convinced Olga of the impossibility of raising a family in such a hostile environment. Russia, once her birthright, had become determined to erase every trace of the Romanovs, viewing them as relics of oppression. This realization marked a turning point in her psyche, from defiant attachment to pragmatic resignation, prioritizing her children's survival over national loyalty. The escape that followed was harrowing, a testament to the chaos of the Civil War's final throes. In November 1919, as Bolshevik forces under Leon Trotsky advanced triumphantly, overwhelming Denikin's whites, Olga, Nikolai, and their two young sons, Tikhon, age 2, and Guri, infant, fled southward to Novorossiysk, a Black Sea port still under white control. Traveling by cart and on foot to evade patrols, they endured starvation, cold, and the constant fear of capture, with Olga clutching her children amid rumors of royalist massacres. Upon arrival, they sought refuge with the Danish consul Thomas Schitt, who provided shelter and informed them of the Dowager Empress Marie's safe evacuation to Denmark earlier that year aboard the British warship HMS Marlborough in April 1919. From Novorossiysk in February 1920, they boarded a ship evacuating white refugees, first to Constantinople, Istanbul, where they spent weeks in a crowded refugee camp on the island of Principo, Bucada, sharing 3 small rooms with 11 other displaced souls. Former aristocrats reduced to communal living, plagued by disease and uncertainty. Finally, through the persistent efforts of her mother, who leveraged her Danish royal connections, as the former Princess Dagmar of Denmark, and British naval assistance, Olga and her family secured passage to Denmark. After brief stops in Belgrade, in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, for diplomatic arrangements, they arrived in Copenhagen on Good Friday, April 2, 1920, Old Style, reuniting with Marie at the Amalienborg Palace before settling at Vidur House, a seaside villa near Copenhagen that Marie had purchased with her sister, Queen Alexandra, of the United Kingdom. This marked the beginning of Olga's European exile, a phase of relative stability overshadowed by emotional strains. They settled in a villa near Copenhagen, under the Dowager Empress's roof, but the reunion was far from happy. The old tensions between mother and daughter, stemming from Marie's domineering personality and disapproval of Olga's independent choices, persisted and intensified in the confined space of exile. Marie, a formidable figure accustomed to imperial deference, could never fully accept Olga's commoner husband, Nikolai, viewing him as beneath Romanov standards despite his military valor and devotion. She rarely allowed Kulikovsky to dine at the same table during formal meals, relegating him to separate quarters or staff areas, a humiliating reminder of class hierarchies, even in displacement. Furthermore, Marie found her two grandsons, Tikhon and Guri, loud and unruly, their boisterous energy clashing with her preference for quiet decorum. Olga, acting as her mother's secretary and companion, navigated these frictions daily, balancing filial duty with marital loyalty. Her memoirs subtly convey the strain. Mother's world was still that of the court. Mine had become something simpler, more real. Marie's death on October 13, 1928, at Vidura, freed Olga somewhat. Inheriting a portion of the estate, she purchased Knudsminde farm in Ballerup, northwest of Copenhagen, where she and Nikolai raised chickens, cows, and vegetables, living as modest farmers. The farm became a hub for Russian monarchist exiles who visited to pay homage, but it also attracted Soviet scrutiny. World War II compounded their woes. Nazi Germany's invasion of Denmark on April 9, 1940, led to occupation, food shortages, and the brief internment of Tikhon and Guri as prisoners of war due to their Russian heritage. Post-1945, with Soviet forces occupying nearby Bornholm Island and accusations of Olga harboring anti-communist spies, fears of assassination or extradition mounted. In May 1948, at age 66, Olga faced exile anew, emigrating to Canada with her family aboard the SS Empire Brent, settling first in Toronto and later on a farm in Halton County, Ontario. The ghost of Anastasia. Olga had accepted the grim fate of her brother, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, executed by Bolshevik forces in Ekaterinburg on July 17, 1918. Reports from White Army investigators and fragmented eyewitness accounts painted a picture of merciless slaughter in the basement of the Ipatiev house, dubbed the House of Special Purpose. The bodies were mutilated, burned, and buried in shallow graves to erase any trace of the Romanovs. Olga, having fled Russia amid Civil War chaos, clung to the official narrative of total annihilation. However, initial reports from the Bolsheviks and subsequent investigations left ambiguities. The bodies of Alexei and one of the daughters, possibly Anastasia or Maria, were not accounted for in the primary grave discovered in 1919. This gap, a sliver of uncertainty amid the horror, ignited rumors that fueled Olga's faint, desperate hope. For years she nurtured the slim possibility that, by some miracle, her beloved goddaughter Anastasia, the vivacious Schwipsik, little one, she had doted on with stories, parties, and auntly affection, had survived the massacre. This hope was not born of delusion, but of profound grief intertwined with the chaotic aftermath of the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Survivors' tales of narrow escapes, forged identities, and underground networks of loyalists circulated among the Romanov diaspora. Olga, living in exile in Denmark with her husband Nikolai Kulikovsky and sons Tikhon and Guri, was frequently approached by impostors claiming to be lost relatives. These encounters, often exploitative, tested her resolve, but the case of Anastasia resonated deepest. Anastasia, born in 1901, had been Olga's goddaughter and closest niece, sharing a bond of playfulness and intimacy. Olga recalled Anastasia's impish personality, her fluency in Russian, English, and French, and her physical features, fine nose, expressive eyes, and youthful energy. The absence of definitive remains for 2 children, confirmed by the 1920 Kolchak investigation, allowed whispers of survival to persist. Olga's pragmatism tempered this hope. She knew the Bolsheviks' brutality firsthand, having lost uncles, cousins, and her brother, but human emotion compelled her to entertain the improbable. As she later reflected in her memoirs dictated to Ian Voris, the hope was a faint ember amid the ashes of loss, a psychological lifeline in exile where memories of Tsarskoye Selo teas and family outings haunted her. This duality, rational skepticism versus emotional yearning, defined Olga's approach, revealing a woman whose resilience was rooted in quiet faith and familial devotion. The ember flickered brighter in 1925, when electrifying news spread across Europe, reaching Olga in her modest Danish villa. A woman had been rescued from a suicide attempt in Berlin's Landwehr Canal in February 1920, initially unidentified and institutionalized as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown, at Daldorf Asylum. After 2 years of silence, she began claiming in 1922 that she was Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, having survived the Ekaterinburg execution through a convoluted escape involving sympathetic guards, a cart ride to Romania, and subsequent wanderings. The woman who adopted the name Anna Tchaikovsky before becoming known as Anna Anderson bore a passing resemblance to Anastasia. Similar height, blue eyes, and a scarred foot from an alleged bayonet wound. She recounted intimate details of court life, such as family nicknames, palace layouts, and anecdotes about Rasputin, which swayed some Romanov associates desperate for a miracle. Supporters like Gleb Bodkin, son of the imperial physician, and Lily Den, a lady-in-waiting, championed her, attributing memory gaps to trauma. Anderson's story gained traction amid the post-war fascination with royal mysteries, amplified by books and media. For Olga, the news stirred cautious optimism. If true, it would resurrect a piece of her shattered world. Yet her pragmatism urged scrutiny. Anderson's claims included improbable elements, like giving birth to a child in Romania, which Olga later dismissed as palpably false, given Anastasia's youth and the lack of contact with Queen Marie of Romania, a Romanov relative who would have recognized her. Compelled by duty and hope, Olga decided she had to see for herself. In October 1925, accompanied by her husband Nikolai and former imperial tutor Pierre Gilliard, who had already met Anderson and harbored doubts, she traveled from Denmark to Berlin. The journey was emotionally fraught. Olga later confided to friends that she departed with a little hope in my heart, a tentative openness born from years of grief. Anderson was then at the Mommsen nursing home recovering from tuberculosis, her frail state evoking pity. Olga spent nearly 4 days with her, engaging in conversations, observing mannerisms, and probing for authentic details. The meeting began with Anderson mimicking Anastasia's habit of requesting eau de cologne for her forehead, a gesture that initially stirred Olga, but soon rang false amid inconsistencies. Olga sat by the bedside in the drab room, searching hour by hour for clues, physical resemblances, shared memories, linguistic cues that might confirm the impossible. The encounter proved a disaster, shattering Olga's fragile hope with irrefutable discrepancies. Physically, Anderson deviated markedly from Anastasia. Olga noted that the nose, the mouth, the eyes were all different. Anastasia, last seen by Olga in 1916 at age 15, would have been 24 in 1925. Yet Anderson appeared much older, her features coarser and aged by illness or hardship. Ears, a key identifier in forensic analysis, mismatched. Anastasia's were delicate, while Anderson's were not. Most damningly, language barriers exposed the fraud. Anderson spoke only German, with no proficiency in Russian, Anastasia's native tongue, English or French. all of which the real Grand Duchess had mastered fluently from childhood tutors. Anastasia had been educated in multiple languages, often code-switching in family letters. Anderson's monolingualism was inexplicable. Olga probed anecdotes like a scar story Anderson attributed to Anastasia, but which actually belonged to her sister Maria, revealing briefed but imperfect knowledge. Anderson seemed a consummate actress to Olga, cunning, theatrical, perhaps mentally ill, but unequivocally not her Schwipsick. Olga's rejection was immediate and visceral. As soon as I sat down by that bed in the Mommsen nursing home, I knew I was looking at a stranger, she recalled in her memoirs. Within a month, she wrote to a friend, "There is no resemblance, and she is undoubtedly not A." Publicly, Olga denounced the claims in a Danish newspaper, countering supporters who twisted her initial pity, sending a scarf and letters as endorsement. She clarified, "I sent the gift and letters out of pity," and called the claims a complete fabrication. Olga denied allegations of familial pressure, such as a telegram from her sister Zenia instructing rejection, stating, "I never received any such telegram." Her biographer Voris captured her sympathy. Olga viewed Anderson as possibly ill, not malicious, but the impersonation tarnished Anastasia's memory. The encounter inflicted a crushing blow, forcing Olga to extinguish the last ember of hope she had guarded so long. Departing Berlin, she famously told a friend, "I have left Denmark with a little hope in my heart. I am leaving Berlin with all hope extinguished." This statement encapsulated the torment. Hope's revival only amplified grief's finality. Olga rarely spoke of it afterward, the pain too acute, but her firm conclusion. Anderson was a cruel and tragic fraud, aligned with broader Romanov reactions. In 1928, at Dowager Empress Marie's funeral, 12 relatives signed the Copenhagen Statement denouncing Anderson. "Our sense of duty compels us to state that the story is only a fairy tale." Prince Felix Yusupov called her an adventuress, a sick hysteric, and a frightful play actress. The final chapter. Life in Denmark continued for years, a quiet, unremarkable existence. Then history intervened once more. When World War II ended, the Soviet Union, now a global superpower, extended its influence right to Denmark's doorstep. They had never forgiven or forgotten the surviving Romanovs. Olga, as the sister of the last Tsar, began to live in genuine fear of being kidnapped or assassinated by Soviet agents. The quiet life she had built was no longer safe. In 1948, at age 66, Olga and Nikolai made their last great journey, a decision born of necessity rather than desire. Selling Nudsminde farm for a modest sum, enough to fund relocation but not luxury, they emigrated with their sons, daughters-in-law, and grandchildren to the safety of Ontario, Canada. The choice of Canada was pragmatic. It offered distance from Soviet reach, affordable land, and a welcoming policy for European displaced persons. Post-Babifu boarding the SS Empire Brent in Liverpool, England, after a brief stopover, the family arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia on June 2, 1948, then traveled by train to Toronto. The last Grand Duchess of Russia became a simple farmer's wife, shedding her title for anonymity. They purchased a 200-acre farm in rural Halton County near the village of Campbellville, now part of Milton, for $25,000, a property with rolling fields, a modest house, and outbuildings. Life was hard, demanding physical toil that tested Olga's aging body. Now in her late 60s, she worked in the fields planting crops, tended to chickens and cows, and managed household chores without servants. Nikolai handled heavier labor, while their sons assisted before establishing their own lives, Tikhon as an engineer, Guri in business. Olga's paintings became a vital income source. She created vibrant watercolors of Canadian landscapes, snowy farms, autumn forests, and nostalgic Russian scenes, selling them through local galleries or to visitors. Over her lifetime, she produced over 2,000 works, many unsigned to preserve privacy. Neighbors knew her simply as Mrs. Kulikovsky, a quiet elderly European woman with a kind smile, sad eyes, and a faint accent, unaware that the woman feeding chickens had once resided in a 900-room palace like the Winter Palace and was the daughter of Tsar Alexander III and sister to Nicholas II. This anonymity was deliberate. Olga shunned publicity, focusing on family and faith, attending Russian Orthodox services in Toronto. The final years were a slow, quiet decline into poverty and loss as age and economics eroded their stability. By the mid-1950s, the Halton farm proved too burdensome for the octogenarian couple. Maintenance costs soared, and Nikolai's health deteriorated with arthritis and heart issues. They sold it in 1955, relocating to a smaller bungalow at 2130 Camilla Road in Cooksville, a suburb of Toronto, now part of Mississauga, purchased for modest comfort. Here, Olga continued painting and gardening, hosting occasional visitors from the Russian community. By the late 1950s, Nikolai's health failed completely. Bedridden and invalid, he required constant care from Olga, echoing her nursing days. He passed away on August 11, 1958, at age 76 after 42 years of marriage. The forbidden love that had sustained her through revolutions and exiles. Olga, now a widow at 76, was devastated. Biographer Ian Voris, who interviewed her extensively in Canada, noted her profound loneliness, describing Nikolai as her anchor in the storm. Alone and nearly destitute, Olga was forced to sell off the last of her imperial possessions, a few remaining pieces of jewelry and Fabergé heirlooms smuggled out of Russia in 1919, hidden in clothing or entrusted to loyalists. These sales, through discreet auctions, provided temporary relief but underscored her fall from wealth. Once heiress to vast fortunes, she now bartered relics for sustenance. It wasn't enough. Health issues, including arthritis and heart problems, compounded financial woes. In early 1960, frail and unwell, she sold the Cooksville home and moved into a small, rented apartment in Toronto at 4555 Gerrard Street East, above a beauty salon and barbershop, sharing it with Russian friends Vladimir and Sophie Martimianov, who offered companionship and care. The apartment was humble, a few rooms filled with her paintings, icons, and mementos, the salon's hum below a constant reminder of her reduced circumstances. There, in that humble apartment surrounded by her paintings and her memories, Olga Alexandrovna lived out her final days. She slipped into a coma on November 21st, 1960, and passed away on November 24th, 1960, at the age of 78. Her body lay in state at Christ the Savior Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Toronto, attended by émigrés and locals. Buried beside Nikolai at York Cemetery, her grave bears a simple marker: Olga Alexandrovna Kulikovsky. Widely labeled the last Grand Duchess of Imperial Russia, Olga's death closed a chapter on the Romanov saga. Olga's final chapter epitomizes resilience amid inexorable decline. Her journey from czarist opulence to Toronto obscurity illustrates adaptability forged in adversity. Rejecting entitlement, she embraced labor and anonymity, finding dignity in simplicity. Yet her sad eyes betrayed unresolved grief, the executions, exiles, and losses that haunted her. Artistically prolific, her 2,000-plus paintings served as legacy, blending nostalgia with acceptance. Psychologically, her fears in widowhood highlight isolation's toll. but her orthodox faith and family bonds provided solace. Olga's life, ending above a salon, symbolizes the Romanovs' tragic arc, from absolute power to humble erasure, a poignant testament to history's caprice, her enduring legacy. Olga Alexandrovna's story is a profound meditation on loss, survival, and the true meaning of wealth. She was born into a world that no longer exists, a world of imperial splendor that was wiped from the earth with shocking brutality. She lost more than a person should have to lose: her father, her brother, her entire family, her home, her country, and her identity. And yet, she endured. She was stripped of her title, her fortune, and all the trappings of her birth. But she never lost her fundamental dignity, her artistic soul, or her capacity for love. She found happiness not in a palace, but with a commoner soldier in the midst of a war. She found purpose not in commanding servants, but in tending to the wounded. And she found peace not at a royal court, but on a simple Canadian farm. Her life is a powerful testament to human resilience. She was a Romanov who survived the revolution, not through cunning or political maneuvering, but through quiet strength and a stubborn refusal to be broken. She outlived the fairy tale, the nightmare, and all the ghosts of her past. In the end, Olga Alexandrovna may have lost an empire, but in the quiet, humble life she built from its ruins, she may have found something far more valuable: herself. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.